Good evening, everyone. We're going to give folks just a minute or so to join and get acclimated. As you come in, we would love to hear where you're joining us from tonight. You can pop that in the chat, maybe what you're most looking forward to. We are definitely looking forward to a great conversation this evening. So I'm going to get started with my introductory remarks as we're all kind of filtering in. Again, if you'd like to pop in where you're joining from this evening, we would love to hear from you. So hello, everyone. As Director of North Carolina Center for the Book here at North Carolina Humanities, it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. My name is Melissa Giblin, and we are looking forward to the conversation at this evening's virtual book event. With many other choices to spend your time, I thank you for choosing this event and for joining us at the second book event in a series for North Carolina Reads, our statewide book club for 2023. North Carolina Reads features 5 books that explore issues of racial, social, and gender equality in the history and culture of North Carolina. As a nonpartisan statewide nonprofit in North Carolina's affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated panel discussion on Game Changers, Dean Smith, Charlie Scott, and the Era That Transformed a Southern College Town, the second book in our 2023 North Carolina Reads series. Please note, any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my pleasure to welcome North Carolina Humanities Board Trustee Brian Kahn as this evening's moderator. Brian Kahn is a 1997 UNC grad, and he is the office managing partner of the law firm McGuire Woods, LLP in Charlotte. Brian is also a co-producer and head writer of Charlotte Squawks, an annual comedy stage production. Brian lives in Charlotte with his family, all of whom are passionate about and major fans of Tar Heels basketball. We would also like to welcome Art Chansky and Dr. Matthew Andrews as our panelists. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and practice how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel at NC Humanities and like our videos. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab. You can also send it through the chat. We will have a designated time towards the end of the program for audience questions for our panelists. Closed caption is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to share your experience on social media by tagging at NC Humanities on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Drawn together by college basketball in a time of momentous change, Dean Smith and Charlie Scott helped transform a university, a community, and the racial landscape of sports in the South. We are excited for this evening's conversation with Art and Matt to explore how Dean Smith and Charlie Scott played an important role in North Carolina's history. It is my pleasure to turn the event over to Brian to formally introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much. It's my incredible pleasure to be hosting this panel today. And please, everybody who is joining us, let us know where you're coming in from. It looks like we've got folks from all across the state, literally from Wilmington out to Blowing Rock and up and down the coast as well. I just saw someone enter from upstate New York and somebody down in Florida. So we've got a great group of folks here. Just keep chiming in where you're coming in from. It is my pleasure today to introduce 2 amazing guests. Art Chansky graduated from UNC Chapel Hill with a degree in journalism. He fell in love with the university and remained in Chapel Hill as a sports editor for Chapel Hill Weekly under legendary editor Jim Shoemaker, who some of you may know was actually one of the characters or the inspiration for one of the characters in the cartoon Shoe, which was a nationally syndicated cartoon. He was also my journalism professor when I was at UNC decades ago. After leaving North Carolina to work for the Atlanta Constitution for a year, Art returned to Chapel Hill to work as a sports editor for the Durham Morning Herald. He currently works as a sports columnist and commentator and has authored 10 books. Now, among those books is Game Changers, which we're going to discuss today. And this is a book that Art credits as being his most exciting book to both research and write. My other panelist is Dr. Matthew Andrews. Matt Andrews is an associate teaching professor in history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who focuses on the interaction of sport, race, and politics in the United States. Among the courses he teaches at UNC is History 585, entitled Race, Basketball, and the American Dream. He is currently working on a book project that is tentatively titled Uplift, A Racial History of Basketball. Art, Matt, welcome. We're so excited to have you as guests today. And let me just jump right in. I've read Art, I've read your book. It is incredible. I have really, really enjoyed it. One of the comments that I've told everybody that I've talked to is there is so much packed into this book about history, about basketball, about Chapel Hill, about sports. Can you tell us, a little bit, just for the folks that haven't read the book yet, can you tell us a little bit about the background of the book and the broader historical context for what was going on during the period that you discussed?
Matt, you want to take that one? No, it's really an honor to be with you and an honor to have Game Changers selected by North Carolina Reads. It is the most exciting book that I've ever done because I learned so much from it myself. And usually in the past, since I've covered sports all my life, I knew what I was going to write, and I just had to go and research a lot of stuff and verify a lot of stuff. With Game Changers, even though I was in UNC for not the civil rights era, but the Vietnam War era and everything that was still bubbling over from the civil rights era, university, for various reasons, did a marvelous job keeping all that stuff off campus. The civil rights, what was left of the civil rights movement, was on Lower East Franklin Street and on West Franklin Street, which is now the Shishi part of town. That kind of reminds most people of the old Chapel Hill. But they wouldn't let Bill, the chancellor, who supported Dean Smith the job and supported him. Bill Aycock was the only person I found on town that would let a demonstration come into his office building, and it happened to be South Building because he was the chancellor. But the police and the security was supposed to tell everybody at the university if people were not wanted on campus if they were there. And they called Aycock and said, there's a group here and we're going to tell them to turn around. And he said, no, you're not. You send them right over here to South Building. And so Bill Aycock, Bob Seymour, and Dean Smith were kind of a triumvirate in the racial situation. And Dean was really, at that time, Aycock and even Bill Friday and Bob Seymour were doing most of the talking, because Dean Smith hadn't won anything when Charlie Scott came to school. And that's why I kind of talk about this book as being the Southern sports version of Profiles in Courage, JFK's famous book, because Dean Smith was 35 years old. He had DNA about integration because his dad in Kansas integrated high school basketball, but he hadn't won anything. He was coming from a different planet from Charlie Scott, who grew up in Harlem and then went to Laurinburg Academy, and going to Carolina was the first white community he had ever lived in. And he was one of 55 blacks in a student body of 13,000. So Profiles in Courage for those two unlikely compatriots in this thing makes an amazing story.
Yeah, and Matt, I'd love to hear sort of your take, given that you're a history professor, that you've studied a lot of this as well. Kind of set the scene, if you can, for both Chapel Hill and North Carolina more broadly during this time, if you could.
Yeah, sure, Brian. And the first thing I want to say is I want to commend Art for writing this book. I've spoken to him many times, and I always do. It's such an important book. I knew about Art Chansky from his basketball writing. But this book, to me, it's one of the best books about civil rights politics in the state of North Carolina. I'm not from Chapel Hill. I came here as a graduate student and wanted to learn about this town. And I've never learned more about the town that I now live in and that I call home than I have from Art's book. So for those of you who read it, you obviously know this, or if you're just tuning in and hoping to learn something, I'm going to encourage you to read the book, because there's just a wealth of information in there about how this town, this university, and this basketball program was desegregated. Brian, I suppose there are two quick things that I'd want to say if we're sort of setting the context for what's going on. One is what the national college basketball scene is like at this time, and the way in which UNC and Chapel Hill is different from a lot of places, but is similar to some places. Most of the nation, most of the universities in the nation had desegregated their college basketball programs, their universities and their programs at this time. Up in the Northeast, they had desegregated teams by the start of the 20th century. Paul Robeson, for example, famously played for Rutgers in the second half of the 20th century. Out west, Jackie Robinson was a fantastic basketball player at UCLA and was playing winning basketball for the Bruins in the 1940s. The Big Ten, they were desegregated during World War II. So most of the nation desegregated at this time, but not in the South. We're going to talk about North Carolina and the ACC, but we could go even further south, down into the SEC, down into the so-called Deep South, places like Mississippi. In Mississippi, they had something called the unwritten rule in the 1960s, which meant that not only are they not going to desegregate their teams, they're not going to play any desegregated teams. Mississippi State consistently turned down invitations to go to the NCAA tournament because their administration did not want them to play against Black players. So I think it's kind of helpful to put UNC sort of in between those two poles. And then quickly, the only other thing I would add is, in the research that I've done here about the UNC basketball program, I've been struck by how the rise of basketball in this state is sort of wrapped up in the fabric of white Southern pride. I think about the 1957 team, which so many people venerate for obvious reasons, the undefeated team that wins the title against Wilt Chamberlain. But I've been really struck looking at photographs from this moment when UNC wins the championship and reading reactions to this, how many people saw this moment as not just really a moment of UNC pride or North Carolina pride, but a moment of Dixie pride. That's the word that comes up over and over, Dixie pride. UNC won it for the South. And if we think about what's going on in the United States in 1957, a lot of people around the U.S. are disparaging the South for the slow pace of racial change. And I'm really struck at how proud white Southerners are by that winning that championship. And I think if we put Charlie Scott and what Dean Smith and Charles Scott do in that context, it's even a more significant and a more revolutionary story than I first thought.
Yeah, and let me chime in one thing there. Dean Smith came to Carolina in 1958 as an assistant to Frank McGuire. And Frank McGuire coached the Carolina team in 1957, and that's where Dean Smith met him at the Final Four. But when he hired Dean to be the assistant coach, Dean wanted to integrate the program right away. And Frank told him that he had tried to get Wilt Chamberlain into school from Overbrook High School in Philadelphia, but UNC wouldn't let him in. And that sort of sets the stage for what Dean Smith had to go through before he finally could get Charlie Scott. But the idea that Frank McGuire did this and then was thinking about trying to get a Black player in, couldn't, and won it anyway with the four Catholics and a Jew, as they call them. Kern, Quiggs, Rosenbluth was the Jew, and Cunningham and I don't know, the fifth side escapes me. But the idea that he did that speaks just to what Matt said. It gave the South a reason to say, see, we don't need this because we won the national championship anyway. So it was an interesting thing. And the other reason McGuire didn't want a Black was at St. John's, he had gone to the Final Four in 1952 and lost to Kansas, the team that Dean Smith was a reserve on, and they had to play the regionals in Raleigh. And they had a Black player at that time, and the Black player wasn't allowed to stay in a regular hotel room. He had to stay in like a broom closet, and it really irked McGuire tremendously. And he didn't want one of his athletes to have to go through that again in the South.
And And Art, one of the things that struck me about just sort of the climate during this time was how few Black students were on campus at the time that Charlie Scott arrived there. I think the number was in the, below 50. Is that correct?
It's 55 by my research, but whatever, 55 with a student body of 13,000. And most of those 55 ended up being the pioneers who started the Black student movement at UNC. And through that whole time that Charlie was there, they were banging on him, and then eventually Bill Chamberlain, when he was a freshman in 1969, to support the 23 demands they had for Carlisle Citizen. And Charlie was put in a tremendous tough position between obviously his race and his place on the basketball team and his place with the universities. And Dean Smith would say, Charles, now you make your own decision on this, but you have to think about your family from home, your family from at Carolina, the basketball players who are your family, and this school who gave you a chance to play basketball as the first scholarship athlete. And if you were to support the Black student movement, I don't know how that's going to be received, but you need to think about all of those things, and it's your decision. So Dean was like that. He never tried to make anybody do anything, but he always wanted everybody to have all the information.
Yeah, and Brian, just to tag, this from reading Art's book. I think one of the values of it is Art gives us a sense of what it was like to be a Black student at UNC before Charlie Scott was on that campus, let alone after, and the treatment of the first Black students who arrived on campus. Most of the white student body was not happy to see them there. I do advising for UNC, and we work in a building called the Steele Building, and Art's book told me that used to be a dorm, and that the Black students were put on the very top floor away from the white students, where they were essentially terrorized by the white students in the mid 1950s. So not an easy place for Charles Scott to go in the mid 1960s.
Yeah, from the book, I remember a couple of the vignettes that talking about things that Charlie Scott himself had to face, from roommates, from teammates, from I think there was a fraternity that he sort of was invited to pledge and he turned down. Is that right?
Yeah, that's St. Anthony Hall, and they were supposed to be the most liberal, most northern fraternity, and there was such a division of that fraternity that eventually he said, well, this isn't really a good place for him. But I spoke to alumni who were at St. A's, and they all have a different version of the story. Oh yeah, we wanted him. Oh no, there was a split, so time changes your memory genes, I guess, huh?
It does.
Well, we're not quite getting to the questions in the chat, but I'm monitoring it, and it actually aligns with sort of our next question, which is give us a little bit more background, Art or Matt, about the path that both Charles Scott and Dean Smith took to Chapel Hill. And one of the things that I was particularly interested was Laurinburg Institute, which one of the questioners is asking about, because I think that's at least based on what I know, I don't believe it's around anymore, but it's a pretty significant historical place.
Yeah, the campus is still there, and Frank and Sammy McDuffie. Sammy was his wife, and she was the dean. She was the guidance counselor. Frank was the dean, whatever they called it, the president or the head, and he also was the head basketball coach. So those two people were very fatherly, parental guides to a lot of kids. And with Charlie Scott, he came from New York at a time where he wanted to know where all of his AAU basketball buddies were disappearing to over the course of the year. He would show up for games, and Earl Meningall was the GOAT of the playground back then, and he would show up for games and not show up, and all of a sudden he was gone. And Charlie wanted to know where he went, and they said, well, he went to a Southern prep school trying to get an athletic scholarship to college. And Charlie, that struck a bell with Charlie, because no one had ever gone to a college in his family. And he had a guidance counselor in the 9th grade who wanted him to take this test, the standardized test that was offered to anybody that was recommended by guidance counselors all over the city. And they recommended Charlie because they thought he was very smart. And when he was one of the 800 people who passed the test that got the qualifying score, he was assigned to Peter Stuyvesant High School, which was kind of like a magnet school back then. It was a college prep school, and he could do all the work. And the guidance counselor would say, Charles, you can go to college. You can get into college. And he would say, that's fine, but who's going to pay for it? You know, my father's a cab driver, he's an alcoholic, and so forth. And then when he found out that Earl Manigault and the other guys were getting basketball scholarships, that the light bulb went on with him. And on his own, he found out who Frank McDuffie was and wrote a letter to him, went to the guidance counselor in ninth grade in Stuyvesant and got his ninth grade transcript, put it in an envelope, send it to Laurinburg, asking if he could be admitted to Laurinburg. And he did that all on himself. And if you look at Charlie's life, everything he encountered in Chapel Hill, he got out of it himself. No social life, went to North Carolina Central and got it there. You know, couldn't go to various social places. So he found out places where he would be comfortable, and most of it was off campus. But when he ended up finally getting the letter from McDuffie saying that you're in, and I'll give you half the money, and here are 3 or 4 places in New York City where you can go and get the rest of it. That's what Charles did. He did it on his own and packed up a few things in a suitcase and he left. And then the first year that he was there, his father, who was an alcoholic and had lost his cabbie badge and everything else, died. And Charles got on the bus and went back to New York, went to the funeral and then came back. And then McDuffie said, Charlie, you can stay here if you want. And during the summer, you can do anything you want. But if you want to stay here, we're your new family. And he accepted that. And that's when he met Lefty Driesell, who was coaching at Davidson. And Lefty would go over and every year he would say to McDuffie, you got anybody who can get into Davidson and is good enough to play for me? And McDuffie said, yeah, I finally got somebody here. He's the valedictorian of the class, and come and see him play because, you know, he plays what they call above the rim now. No one ever heard of that before. But so that's how Charlie and Lefty Driesell got very close. But because he also got close to Davidson, there were some incidents at Davidson that gave the McDuffies more pause than Charlie did, because Charlie was used to all this racial stuff. He had been through it a lot, you know, anytime he visited a white community, anything like that. So the idea that that Davidson wasn't exactly the right place for him, and Dean Smith found out that he was still making other visits, even though he had made a verbal commitment to Davidson, that gave Dean the impetus to go ahead and recruit him. And there's a famous story when he went to see, oh, there's all kinds of stories. I mean, in that time, Rick Mount was a high school basketball star in Lebanon, Indiana. He was going to be the first high school player with his picture on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And Dean sent one of his coaches, assistant Larry Brown, to Lebanon, Indiana to see Rick Mount. And then John Lotz, he sent the other assistant to Laurinburg to see Charlie, because Dean was never going to offer a scholarship to a kid till his assistant saw him and they gave him the word that he had to go see him. So after the morning that Larry Brown called up after he'd seen Rick Mount, John Lotz answered the phone and John said, hey, Larry, how was Rick Mount? And he said, yeah, it was good, really good. He said, well, I saw a player last night who's better than the player you saw last night. And Larry went, get out of here, you're kidding me. And said, yeah, I saw the guy and we got to tell Coach Smith to go see this guy. And he's a valedictorian of his high school class. So that is how Carolina got into the picture, and Dean and one of the assistants went to see a game. They went to the McDuffie home afterwards for a visit, and that's where Dean invited him to the old Jubilee weekend. I mean, how many people out there, raise your hand if you remember the Jubilee weekend? And he invited Charles, and he said, and Charlie, the Smokey Robinson, the Miracles, and the Temptations are playing. And Charlie fashioned himself as a great soul singer because he was singing for the choir at Laurinburg Institute. So that's how they got Charlie to Chapel Hill, and everybody rolled out the red carpet for him. And Dean took him to Binkley Baptist Church, was an integrated church. He had faculty members who were African-American. Dick Grubar took him to a party at the KA house and called the guys at the KA and said, hey, I'm bringing this guy over and you need to welcome him and treat him right. So that was the scene when he was recruited. But like Ryan said, when he got to campus, it was a completely different story. He couldn't go to the fraternity parties. He couldn't go to Airing House and party with Larry Miller and the football team. And so that's why it got very, very difficult for Charlie. And they had to figure out a way, because it was really important for him and Coach Smith to make it at Carolina. And one of the visits that he made after he had committed to Davidson is he went to Duke. and Duke had a player named CB Claiborne, who was 1 year older than Charlie. And Charlie visited with CB, and CB told him, don't come here. Don't come here. And Charlie said, why not? He said, because they're not ready for us here. Don't come here. And so it was true. In 10 years, it was 10 years until Gene Banks signed at Duke as the next really big star, black star at Duke. And that might have happened at Carolina if Charlie hadn't made it through. But who came right after him was Bill Chamberlain, and then Phil Ford, and then Ray Harrison, and eventually Michael Jordan and James Worthy. So it was a really important, the whole litany of success at Carolina hinged on whether Charlie made it in Chapel Hill or not.
One tidbit in there that I thought was fascinating, and Art, tell me if I'm misremembering this, but I think when the visit or after the visit, when they drove him back to Laurinburg, was Larry Brown one of the assistant coaches, and did he kind of put McDuffie or Charlie Scott and McDuffie on the spot by making the offer then? And McDuffie said, yeah, you can accept now, whereas before he was told to make all his visits. Is that right?
Yeah, because on the way back, Larry and John Lotz were saying, well, how'd you like it? How'd you like Chapel Hill? Like, oh, I liked it. I liked the players. And Dean was really smart. Dean didn't want him to hang out with the guys who he wouldn't play with if he came to Carolina. So he had him play with the freshmen that year who were going to be sophomores, and even Larry Miller, who would have 1 year left of playing with Charlie, because Dean wanted him to be friends with the guys who he would play with. And that doesn't sound like a revolutionary thing, but back then they had him hang out with the stars of the team, so the recruits would go home and say, yeah, I hung out with Bob Berger, I hang out with so-and-so and so-and-so, but it wouldn't do him any good because he didn't know those guys when they got, so that was one of the ways that Dean revolutionized recruiting. But the idea that Charlie had such a difficult journey, and he told McDuffie that he was going to go visit some schools, and McDuffie said, okay, you got to visit 10 of them. You got to pick 10 schools. And here's a big box of letters that we got. Pick 10 schools and you'll visit them. And after you visit 10, but you have to visit all 10, then if you don't like any of those, you can go to Davidson. So when Charlie was riding back with Lotz and Larry Brown, they said, did you like it? Did you like it? He said, would you like to come here? And Charlie said, yeah, I think so. I think Chapel Hill would be good for me, but they're not, Mr. McDuffie is not going to let me go anywhere until I complete my 10 visits. And I think Carolina was maybe the 5th one that he made. So when they pulled the car into Laurinburg Institute that day, Lotz and Larry Brown, who were 2 slick New Yorkers, I mean, they were sales guys, they were recruiters big time. And so they got it with McDuffie and they said, hey, Charlie he wants to come to Chapel Hill, he had a great, but you say that he can't go and can't commit or sign anything until he goes to 5 more visits. And McDuffie said, oh, no, he can go to Carolina. And the backstory in that is McDuffie really wanted him to go to Carolina because he thought Charlie would be better at representing a state university, more prestige, more, than tiny Davidson. And it would be better for Laurinburg Institute as well. So that's how Dean showed up the next day with a scholarship for Charlie, who signed it. And Lefty, found out about it. He was recruiting in Texas, flew back, jumped in his car, went to Laurinburg, and got there right after Charlie had signed. And Dean came out with a big handshake, saying, hey, Lefty, how you doing? And there's a story that Lefty wouldn't shake his hand. There's another story that Lefty spit in his hand. But it was done because Charlie signed the scholarship and he went to Carolina. But to this day, Charlie Scott is still very good friends with Lefty Driesell. And he always said, Lefty, I love you best, but Chapel Hill is just a better place for me to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up, Art, how the McDuffies thought there would be more symbolism, more significance to Charles Scott going to UNC than to Davidson, flagship state university. And if we think about it in a real fundamental way, Charlie Scott is the symbol of integration in this state. There are other symbols in other states, but who comes to mind? The Floyd McKissick, maybe, but not that many people know that name compared to the name of Charlie Scott. So I think the Mr. McDuffie was onto something there. And Art clearly knows all the stories and all of the details, but I'm just speculating when I say this. I read enough stories about athletes, and often white athletes, who go down to the South, like Joe Namath, for example, going down to Alabama and really having a hard time with the racial rules down there. Like, this is a different culture than where I'm from, and being confused about what's going on. So I would assume that time that the Charlie Scott spent down in Laurinburg was a pretty critical sort of intervening moment from a kid coming from New York City, and then having to be kind of in the spotlight of Chapel Hill. Wouldn't you say, Art?
I would say that, and that goes back to Dean Smith tried to, his first year as the head coach, he tried to recruit a kid named Lou Hudson from Greensboro. He went to Greensboro Dudley, which was a black high school, but a black high school with college prep courses.
Right.
And Lou Hudson had all the grades and all the test scores to get him into Carolina, and Carolina wouldn't let him in. They just said no. And that really pissed Dean off, because he didn't have any juice then. There was nothing he could do about it. He actually got an African-American friend named Ben Renwick a job in the undergrad admissions office after that. So he'd have somebody in the admissions office. And Lou Hudson went on to Minnesota, All-American, Big Ten, all Big Ten, all NBA, was a great player, and he couldn't get into Carolina. So Dean came up with a mantra, a strategy. There had to be three things. First of all, the kid had to be smart enough to get in, no questions asked, test scores, the grade point average, everything. And they couldn't turn him down. It had to be so over the top. And Charlie was like that. The second thing, he wanted Charlie Scott to be a star, his first black to be a star. He didn't want the first black to be seen as the token sitting at the end of the bench, like Duke had with CB Claiborne, like Maryland had with Jones and the other kid. He wanted him to be a star. So when Charlie at 6'5", he crossed campus, everybody went, "Hey, that's our basketball star." They want everybody to say, that's the guy who sits at the end of the bench. And the third thing is, he wanted him to be tough enough to put up with what he was going to put up with, even in Chapel Hill. But then we went to places like Columbia, South Carolina, Clemson, Virginia. And Charlie was, because he had to put up with this stuff all his life. And still, he went through things that Dean Smith never thought that he ever encountered, especially in Columbia, South Carolina. So that's the combination of those two. And that's why they're both so courageous guys. And, Dean Smith, if there was a misstep along the way, Dean Smith hadn't won anything. And so, his job was always in jeopardy, as far as I could tell, from the hierarchy at Carolina, which wasn't exactly the liberal bastion that that it might be today, or that we thought it was back then.
What was it? And I know you covered this some in the book, but what was it, do you think, about Dean Smith's background, his upbringing, that sort of drove him to be such an important figure in integrating college basketball in the South?
Well, his dad was a high school coach in Emporia, Kansas, and he was the guy who integrated high school sports in the state of Kansas. And he did it with one guy who he made the team. He didn't care. Alfred Smith didn't. He wanted the best players, so he did it with one. And then later on, when Dean was about 10 years old and he would travel around with the Emporia team, like as the team mascot, they were going to play a game in Lawrence, Kansas, and they were going to stay at the Jayhawk Hotel. And the whole team got off the bus, went into the hotel, and the manager of the hotel wouldn't give him the rooms because Chick Taylor was with him. He was the black player on the Emporia team. And Dean said, "We're out of here." I don't know where he took him, but he stormed out of the hotel. About 30 years later, when Charlie Scott was he was a sophomore with Carolina. Carolina had a game at Georgia Tech, which hadn't joined the ACC yet. And the same exact thing happened. He had Randy Forehand, the manager, make a dinner reservation for them after they were going to practice the day before the game. They walked into the restaurant and we'll seat everybody, but he has to eat back there or whatever. And Dean was like a flashback from 30 years. Exactly the same thing happened. He said, "We're out of here." And he walked out. And I don't know whether he just had a sixth sense about it, but he had a wad of cash. There were no credit cards in those days anyway, but he had a wad of cash in his pocket, took it out, gave it to Bill Guthridge, gave it to Randy Foyne, the manager, and said to the kids, "Have them go eat wherever they want and meet back at the hotel." And everybody I talked to who was in that incident at that time thought that Dean did that because Dean was going to circle back to that restaurant and he was going to let the manager or the owner, whoever it was, have it because that's the way he operated.
Well, and just to kind of talk a little bit more about that, during this time in Chapel Hill, a lot of the businesses were not integrated. They did not accept Black patrons, and there's a lot about the town of Chapel Hill, as both of you have alluded to. You know, people think of it as, you know, always been a progressive liberal place, but in fact, that's not necessarily true, despite that reputation.
Oh, true. I mean, they had black and white water fountains, black and white restrooms. They had black and white. Actually, blacks couldn't try on clothes in clothing stores because it was whites only in the what do you call it, the tryout room, or the you know what I'm talking about.
Dressing
So yeah, dressing room exactly. And so Chapel Hill, and then the first game that Charlie played as a varsity player. Some people came to watch him play in the freshman team, but it was still, you know, there's a little attitude. And when they announced Charlie Scott, Larry Keith tells me that. I wasn't at the game, but Larry Keith, who went on to write for Sports Illustrated, is a great alumnus of UNC. He was covering it, and they went crazy for, you know, for Dick Grubar, Rusty Clark, Joe Brown, all the players were announced, Larry Miller, of course. And when Charlie was announced, there was a lot of noise, but it was a completely different sound from the stands. It was like half cheering and half buzzing, you know, that kind of thing, which you might expect because here we got somebody from Mars, you know, joining our basketball team. But then when I saw him play, the cheering got very unanimous as far as the crowd was concerned.
Yeah, Chapel Hill sounds like a, you know, when you move here, you get the stories of what a progressive town Chapel Hill is, and it is to an extent. But I think it's a line I know from Art's book. I think it's Frank Porter Graham who described like Chapel Hill was like a lighthouse. You know, there's this light going out on the top. It's a beacon of illumination and enlightenment, but down at the bottom, it's dark. And it's dark. I think if you're African American living in that town, living in the segregated part of the town, and for me, the value of this book when I assign it to my students, and when I teach this course on race and basketball, I have my students read it. I want them to know how desegregation happened in the town of Chapel Hill, and the stories that I read in Art's book. I didn't know those stories before. Those stories are buried in this town, and they're stories of high school and college students being spit on and being struck, and in one awful example, being urinated on by the people who own these buildings. There's a professor who goes along with one of these sit-ins and is beaten so severely. I guess it's unclear if it's related, but he dies of a brain hemorrhage a couple of months ago. I mean, people had to put their lives on the line to try to desegregate Chapel Hill. And the kicker is I'm not trying to take anything away from him. It didn't work. It actually didn't really change anything until the federal government came along in 1964 and instituted the Civil Rights Act and just said, enough, you just can't do this anymore. So many people went through so much turmoil and faced so much violence trying to desegregate this town. But those are the types of stories that you learn about in Art's book.
Well, Brian, you know, what you mentioned about Jim Shoemaker, at the time, he was the editor of the Chapel Hill Weekly, and he eventually couldn't take Orville Campbell anymore, who Orville, you know, he had a printing business right next to the newspaper, and he was printing all the catalogs for UNC and all the brochures and all that. So anything negative about UNC reflected on him, you know, his business. But the fact that Jim Shoemaker was writing about how the public schools in Chapel Hill didn't desegregate in 1964 like they're federally ordered, and he kept writing about what's going on. What are you waiting for? And he was the light from the newspaper all the time. And finally, he backed Howard Lee for running for mayor of Chapel Hill, and he turned out with Dean Smith's backing and Bob Seymour's backing, he became the first Black mayor of a Southern municipality. And that's, you know, Howard Lee got together with Bill Friday and the people who were on their side in terms of the protest at Lenoir Hall for paying the employees a living wage, and all of that stuff just gradually built. And when it rolled into the Vietnam War, that's when the students and the young people in Chapel Hill finally were emboldened to stand up and make their voices known.
Yeah, the story of Howard Lee and how intertwined, his rise and Dean Smith's rise and, Bill Friday, all of those folks. It's really an amazing read. Matt, I felt the same way. There's so many stories here, stories about restaurants that maybe are still there, that were there when I was there, places
Brady's,
like Mama Dips,
Yeah.
like and one of the ones that I remember hearing about when I was there was how Dean, was it the Pines maybe, and how Dean Smith would take recruits there. Art, can you talk a little bit about that story? Because I think the way that you understand it's a little bit different than the lore.
Oh, it's completely different. I mean, there's this one guy from Michigan wrote a biography of Dean Smith. I don't know why people decide they're going to write biographies of people that they don't know, they've never followed them. They just decide to write it. But he had it completely wrong. The way the story was is that Bob Seymour called Dean up and said, I have a student in our seminary here that I want to take to the Pines restaurant. And if you come with me, because you are an assistant to Coach McGuire, who takes his team there for all the pregame meals, anytime they were leaving town, they ate at the Pines, I think that they'll seat us. And they did. They went over there, and Leroy and Agnes Merritt looked at each other and they said, okay, come on in. And they seated him. They had a meal. But it was the first and last Black person to ever eat in the Pines until the entire town desegregated. And the reason why they were doing it was because it was just like today. Everything's about money. They knew that Dean would go back and tell McGuire that they wouldn't seat him. And McGuire, who supported Dean in everything that he did, would not take his team there anymore. And imagine all the business the Pines would. So they weren't doing any great egalitarian thing there. They were just taking care of themselves. And the stories are all over the place about what happened. But Bob Seymour, who was living at the time when I did this book, he confirmed that that's exactly the way the story was.
And to your point, Brian, about lore, when I moved in here, the story was Dean Smith desegregated the town of Chapel Hill. And Art's book, it tells us it's slightly more complicated than that.
Slightly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He did. I mean, he stood up. Howard and Lillian Lee tried to buy a house in the neighborhood off of Ephesus Church Road, and they wouldn't sell it to him. And Dean got on. By this time he had won a couple of championships, so he had some juice now. And he got on with some realtors and the mayor of the town and so forth. And they let him buy a house there. But it was a couple of mornings they woke up with a cross burning in their front yard. So it was just, despite what the reputation was, it was a small southern town, no different than Auburn, Alabama, Lexington, Kentucky, a lot of places like that. There were university towns that were supposed to have a liberal faction, but it was way different than a lot of people remember it as.
Talk a little bit about the teams themselves that Charlie Scott was a part of, and just sort of what his existence was like as a member of that team and as a student during that time.
Well, Charlie played as a freshman, and he came in with Eddie Fogler, Jim Delaney, Gra Whitehead, and Al Almer. And Charlie was the fifth guy. He was coached by Larry Brown, who was 26 years old, and scrimmaged with the team. Larry Brown, who went on to be an ABA MVP in the All-Star game and a great point guard, one of the greatest point guards to ever play, and then a longtime coach. He played with the team. And besides Charlie, he was the best player on the team. And so some people knew how good Charlie was. The team knew how good he was because Larry would keep him out of practice because he would dominate his own teammates in practice sometimes. And Dean even did that too sometimes when he moved up to the varsity. And on occasion, players would say about when Charlie would have the ball and was going to make a play, they would turn around and box somebody out and try to, get the rebound. And one of them would get hit in the back of the head with Charlie's pass, because Dean always said, you give up a good shot, they get a better shot. And Charlie's passing it to you under the basket. So, be aware of what's going on here. And then the fact that he played above the rim was something that none of those guys had ever seen or ever played with before. It was a spectacular, just a spectacular scene when he finally played at Carmichael Auditorium, and and it's very hard for people who grew up in the racial South to accept somebody. And there were all kinds of nicknames they had for Charlie. A lot of them didn't call him the N-word, but there were nicknames that people called him. But boy, they were proud when he led them to victory over NC State and Duke and the other people. So it was a very split, difficult time for a lot of people. And I'm proud of the Black citizens in Chapel Hill who stood up and fought for civil rights and the civil rights movement. The one time, they were decided that they were going to wait till the crowd got into Willen Gym for a game against Wake Forest. And they were all going to go and lay down on all the roads that were exit roads from the parking lot. And they knew they were going to get taken away, but all the police and all the fire department had to come and drag them off the street. And there's pictures in the book and Game Changers about how some of those people were being dragged upstairs and dragged downstairs and so forth. So, I mean, it was just rough. It wasn't exactly Oxford, Mississippi and places like that, but there were some things that were as rough as any others.
And it sounds like the team dynamic itself was very different than what you might expect, in that, there was a sort of newness to the relationship between, what was an all-white team and a new player coming in. And certainly it sounds like socially there were times when Charlie felt isolated, and times when, and it per your book, it sounds like there were times when he was, very happy, very thankful, felt very included, but at other times not as much.
Yeah, he was at home within the lines, 94 by 50 or whatever they say. That was where he was at home. And he made it on himself by, the Black student movement guys told him that social life was happening at NC Central. So we went there, and he actually met Margaret Holmes, who was his first wife. And they got married after sophomore year. And Charlie admits in the book that he married Margaret because he was lonely. He had been on the 1968 Olympic team with JoJo White from Kansas and guys like that, who talked about how great college was because their schools were fully integrated at that time. And the Kansas situation actually came from when Alfred Smith had started back in the 30s. So when Charlie came back, he was so lonely, he said to himself, I'm never going to be lonely again. And he came back and asked Margaret to marry him, and they did, and they lived in an apartment in Durham. But Margaret talks about how Charlie became the most famous Black person in the state of North Carolina when he started for the Tar Heels, and they won all those games, and the games, just C.D. Chesley was starting to put them all on TV. And she said it was very difficult for her because everybody wanted to come up and talk to Charlie, but no one would pay any attention to her. So, these social dynamics all over the place. And I was the only one who actually interviewed Margaret, and she's a wonderful lady, and we had a terrific talk, and she remembered it as being a very mixed blessing experience in her life.
Well, I suppose what you're talking about also, Art, speaks to how we look at trailblazers like Jackie Robinson and trailblazers like Charlie Scott, and they're remarkable individuals, remarkably strong individuals who at some point have to endure all this by themselves. It's all on them. But there's almost always a pretty major support system behind them. And so his wife here, I'm struck by Charlie Scott's relationship with the Lees and how close they were to him, letting him stay at their home for a little while, how he, wanted to get off campus when he was looking for a social life, and he was welcomed over there in Durham. I mean, it speaks to how, though he is the trailblazer, there's often this larger support system behind figures like this.
There was, and Charlie got a little mad when somebody mentioned, Dean told him to go to have a social life at North Carolina Central. He said, no, he didn't do that. I discovered that myself. He was very proud of that. And his relationship with Dean Smith was way better after he finished playing, like most of the kids.
Yeah.
But, he wanted to come to Carolina because he thought, on balance, Chapel Hill was the best place for him. And it was. It might not have been as open and liberal as he thought it was going to be, or how it was pretended to be that way during the recruiting visit. But it wasn't great. And it was Charlie's strength that got him through. And Matt, I'm so grateful for you that you have that as part of your reading list in your class, because to me, the 40 and over crowd, maybe the 45 and over crowd, the book sold like crazy, and it's still selling like crazy. The younger set, and I know that because I have a stepson who I had to make sure I gave the book to so that he would read to understand. I think the younger set really has to understand that they're so proud. They go to the Dean Dome, they go crazy at games and all that, but they have to understand where this basketball program came from and how courageous these two people were. Dean Smith from one part of the world, Charlie Scott from another, how courageous they were and what was at stake for them to make sure that Carolina would be one of the pioneer programs in the South, and it was. And from that, it became 30 years of just being a legendary basketball program. And you're the one who has the younger people reading that book. And I always thought that it should be mandatory reading for all alumni, but especially for the young students to really understand and to be really proud. And Roy Williams was a product of Dean Smith. It was a product of Frank McGuire, and all of that stuff is related to each other. And the example of C.B. Claiborne telling Charlie not to come there because it wasn't for them, that was really rampant all over the South.
Well, it's my pleasure to assign it. I know you're not saying we're equally responsible for the power of this book, but maybe I'll take it that way. But I'm going to add on to that, because I think this is something you may have been involved with as well. I would have students read the book and then go to the Carolina Basketball Hall of Fame. So read this book about the desegregation of the team and Dean Smith and Charles Scott, and then go down to the Hall of Fame. And I gave them an assignment. They had to spend 45 minutes walking around. And how do they tell that story there? And before the pandemic, when I would have students do that, they would come back furious. There wasn't a single photograph of Charles Scott in the Carolina Basketball Hall of Fame. The only mention of him was that he was an academic All-American, which is something you ought to mention, and that's great. But that was and meanwhile, Tyler Hansborough has one of these casings in his uniform and all these photographs and all these players. They weren't even telling the story of Charles Scott at the Carolina Basketball Hall of Fame. I think they started to figure out what was about to happen when like 150 students went in there and started asking, where are the Charles Scott photographs? After the pandemic, suddenly there were photographs in there.
They did, because they were calling me and asking me for my comments. And I said, I gave them the names of the people at the athletic department to talk to. And another thing is, I love my university. I'm proud of my university, but I'm mad at him still because Charlie Scott still hasn't received, the kind of credit that he deserves. There's a Carolina First group of people who are honored for having done something for the first time at UNC. And of course, Charles is on that as Carolina First. But all of those people who are on that list of Carolina First are supposed to have an academic scholarship named after them. Some of them have. Charlie Scott hasn't. And I keep bringing that up to the people. Most of the people are brand new to that. They don't even understand what I'm talking about. But I'm saying Carolina First, and they had this little thing with the Pioneers, and they introduce them at games and all that. But Charlie's bigger than that. He's the most important. And in 2018, there was a 50-year reunion of the 67, 68, and 69 champions. And I talked to most of those guys when I was doing the book, but Roy Williams said, I want books for the swag bag that we want to give all these guys. So I brought him in, and together Roy signed them and I signed them too. And they had a dinner on Saturday night. And it was really unbelievably moving, because the players who stood up, half of them talked about learning that they didn't understand and learned over the years of what Charlie had gone through. And they wish that they had been more supportive and understanding.
Sure.
Some of them were crying. Some of them were in tears because they understood what an opportunity it was for them. But they also knew that they were 18 and 19, worrying about their girlfriends, worrying about their grades and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes it takes the maturation and the story being told for them to understand it. And I think Charlie really appreciated that.
The Joker in me wants to ask if the other half stood up and said, I wish Dean Smith would have let us run against UCLA in the final in 16 rather than slow it down.
Like Charlie and Larry Miller wanted to, right?
Yeah.
Half the team was standing in two corners or three corners, and the other guys were running around. So,
Well, so now both Dean Smith and Charlie Scott have an incredible list of accolades and accomplishments, but I'd like to hear from both of you. What do you think was the most important achievement, or what they would think was the most important achievement that they had?
Well, I think it's the same for both. I mean, people say, "Oh, Dean only won 2 national championships." I mean, he was my book. He was the greatest coach because he was way more than the coach. And I'm working on a book right now that I hope comes out in a couple of years. And if it does come out, it's because I have gotten enough stories of why Dean Smith matters, not about his coaching. It could be related to basketball, but why it matters to the people whose lives he touched back then and still think about him every day, still remember the things that he told them. So to me, the fact that he put his job on the line to get Charlie Scott into Carolina and to get him through without compromising. I mean, Charles was a good student. He had to go to class. He had to do everything they needed to do, but he fought for him, and Bob Seymour fought for him, and the people of Chapel Hill. There were several families who opened their homes to Charlie when he needed to get off campus. The Lees were one of them. So I think that still, to me, is the shining star of his career, and Charles for doing it, for picking Carolina and deciding he was going to stay there when I think there were probably a lot of schools in the Northeast in New York reaching out to him and trying to get him to leave somewhere, to go somewhere else. So I think both of them should be credited for the same thing.
Yeah, Charles Scott, exactly, for doing it, for being the guy who's going to go on the court, for being the guy who's not sure you're going to get off the court safely when you go on some of these courts. That's awfully brave. And to piggyback and expand a little bit about what Art was saying about Dean Smith. So as an undergraduate, I went to UCLA, where I sort of learned to worship at the altar of John Wooden. Oh, John Wooden, greatest coach ever. The more I learned about John Wooden, and then the more I learned about Dean Smith, the more I'm siding with the Dean Smith people. And it's because of the way Dean Smith, and continued to do after this. This is one of the many great things that Dean Smith did. Dean Smith, look, whatever your politics are, he was a principled man, and he fought against the death penalty in this state at a time when that was not a popular position, but he believed in it. He and his wife raised awareness against sexual trafficking. He endorsed, I mean, what a weird idea. He endorsed political candidates, something college coaches do not do anymore because they're just trying to thread the middle there. And he tried to get his players, and you probably know the story I'm alluding to endorse political candidates. He was a principled person who believed that there was a right way to do things. I've been on this university about 15 years now. There were times over the last few years when there were some big issues on our campus. And I remember thinking to myself, if only Dean Smith was here. Dean Smith, he would speak up and he would say what people need to hear.
Yeah. And, Linnea told me one time that in the middle of the academic scandal here, and I had lunch with her one day about, she provided the material for the prologue and the epilogue in Game Changers about her having to go to the White House to get the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama. But she was saying at that time, she said, they're calling this the greatest academic scandal in the history of college sports. I mean, God, I wish Dean, he was still alive at the time, but he couldn't, he couldn't contribute, but she wished that he could, because, he would have set the people straight. Now, it was wrong what they did. It wasn't that much, it was very similar to what happened in a lot of other academic institutions that let the athletics get away from them a little bit. But the fact that when you have a brand like Carolina, the good's going to be beyond the good and the bad's going to be beyond the bad. And that's what happened. And she wished, like you said, that he was around to help the university get through that crisis.
Well, I think we're about to go get some questions from the chat. But before we do, I want to make sure that I ask you both what other projects you have going on. What are you excited about coming up in both of your lives as authors here? And Matt, I know you've got something going on. You want to speak about that first?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm like everyone else. I've entered the podcast world, and I've got a podcast on the links between sports and politics. It's called American Sports with Matt Andrews. It's on Spotify. It's actually a lot of like what I do in my lectures. I mean, so if you're interested about the types of lectures that I give in my courses that explore sports and politics. I'd encourage you to give that a listen. I'm also working, as we heard at the start, on a kind of a long history of basketball, but a racial history of basketball. Brian, so I grew up in the 1970s and the 1980s, and actually so many of the things that I think about race were things that I learned watching basketball. Basketball is always been, in my mind, this racial drama, a place of segregation and desegregation and integration, but also a place where ideas about whiteness and blackness are expressed and challenged on the court. I have a hard time watching basketball without thinking about race. So I'm trying to get all these ideas down into a start to finish history, racial history of the sport of basketball. So I have no idea when that will be coming out. I might be a slower writer than Art, although Art's not a slow writer. He's got a dozen books, but it's going slowly.
Well, first of all, Dean Smith, one of the things that it's not like he wasn't conflicted about things. Like, for example, he knew that Adolph Rupp was a serial racist.
Yeah.
He would not integrate Kentucky basketball when after everybody in that league and everybody in other schools would, even into the early 70s when he was still coaching. But he respected Adolph Rupp as a coach, and he would say, people would say when he got close to Rupp's record that he would quit the day before because records didn't mean that much to Dean Smith. But other people would say, yes, he wants to break Adolph Rupp's record because his label as a racism in college basketball was a damaging one. And of course, when lost you guys for a second.
Okay.
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm back here.
Okay.
And then when Texas Western in College Park in 1966, the first team to start 5 blacks beat Pat Riley and the Kentucky Wildcats.
Yes.
That was a big win for racial equality in sports and basketball. What I'm working on, I want to tell you this, and you may have already made in part, but Jim Lampley is back in town, and Jim and I have been friends for a long time.
Yeah.
And Jim's 2 major interests are sports and politics.
Yeah.
So I'll give you Jim's contact. You need to get him on your podcast.
Jim and I we have hooked up. We are talking. We're talking about teaching a course together. In fact,
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm glad you have. He's great to have him back in town, and he is. He's got an amazing story. So
yeah, that guy can tell stories, but they're all great stories. So
they really are.
Oh my,
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm working on that with Jim. We're working on a memoir, his memoir. We're trying to figure out if we just want to tell his story, which is an incredible story, or we want to tie it to important events that happened in sports. And I think that's the kind of the way we're leaning on it right now.
And Art, you mentioned something about a children's book too. Is that? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, about 5 or 6 years ago, it was a couple of years ago before the pandemic, Phil Ford and I wrote a book called The Kid Who Couldn't Dunk. And it's Phil Ford's story. And it's a children's book that has been an inspiration for a lot of people. Because when Phil was in high school, he was little, and even when he got to be 5, they said he was 6 feet. He was more like 5'11"ish. He could never dunk a basketball. He still never dunked a basketball on a 10-foot goal. And what his coach told him, said, Phil, you go this way better than anybody. You don't go this way, And so what you need to learn is the other things. You're a really good basketball player. So learn other things and practice the other things and become better than everybody else at that. And so that's the story that is The Kid Who Couldn't Dunk, to find something that you like and that you're good at and practice it and become very prolific at. And we went on a book tour around, we were ready to go outside of the Triangle when the pandemic hit, but it was interesting. When there was an event, there would be 100 people lined up, all of them parents dragging their kids along because the kids had no idea who Phil Ford was, but the parents did, and they wanted their kids to meet Phil Ford. And now I'm working with a couple of people from Wayne County in North Carolina, trying to get that book into every elementary school library in the state and every public library in the state, because of the dismal K-3 reading statistic that North Carolina has. I think it's 48th in the country. And Dean used to say, or his parents would say, that Dean didn't want to read when he was a kid. What his parents did, they left sports books on his bedside table. And so that was the subject. So we feel like the parents will read The Kid Who Couldn't Dunk with their children at night. It'll be a great inspiration. And the parents can still say that I watched Phil Ford play. He was the greatest point guard in ACC history, if not college basketball history. So that's a fun project, as long as we can get the funding to put it in hardback, so it'll be safe. It'll be safe in libraries for at least a while before they get torn apart. So that's the name of the book, and Phil's very anxious not only to do that, but also go to libraries around the state and talk to parents and their kids about the inspiration of finding something that you like to do, find something that you're good at, and practice, practice, practice.
It's great, Art.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, I think it's time to get some questions from the chat. And I believe Melanie is going to jump on here and read some of these off. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And thank you so much, Art and Matt. What a wonderful conversation we've had tonight. Thank you both so much for your participation. We've had some great questions and comments coming in through the chat and the Q&A box. So please continue to send those. We'll spend a couple minutes and try to get to as many questions as we can. So Art and Matt have a fun question kind of here from Laura to start us off, hot off the press. She'd like your thoughts on, and I quote, "Where the heck is Caleb Love going? What team do you expect him to join? Are we glad? Are we sad that he didn't return to UNC Chapel Hill? And what kind of player do you think that he will be next year?"
Well, I'm going to write about this in my daily column that's going to go up tomorrow morning. So I'll give you all a preview of it. But I hope it's a win-win for Caleb Love in Carolina, because Caleb Love should be remembered. His legacy at Carolina is that he shot the Tar Heels to two of their biggest wins in history, the 2 games against Duke, to end Coach K's career at Cameron and end his career period in the Final Four. And those are 2 victories that both, I always say this about when this happens, both fan bases will never forget that for different reasons. And Caleb Love is the guy who did that. So his legacy at Carolina should be positive. You know, and I know Allison Friedman, who is the executive director of Carolina Performing Arts, who put that great video together, artists and athletes and athletes and artists. And Caleb was the athlete with an Alvin Ailey dancer who participated in that. And she said he was just a joy to work with. He was wonderful, cooperative. He worked with the dancer to make sure that the dancer understood what the basketball moves were, and he listened closely to understand what the dancer's moves were. So if you watch the video, you see the simulation between the actions. So Caleb Love should be remembered as that. Laura, I don't know where he's going to go. He might go to Missouri, which is a very free shooting team, and they got a good program, and he's from St. Louis. But you know, I think that Caleb will. I think he'll. Everybody, the problem with him, the pressure this year on Caleb Love was enormous because everybody was waiting for him to get hot. And everybody knew that Carolina wasn't going anywhere until he got hot, like he got hot last March. So it was a tough thing for him. And I'm glad he's going somewhere to get a fresh start, because I think that'll be good for him. And I'm not sure where that'll be. I hope it's successful. But I want Carolina also to benefit from that, because Caleb, it didn't work for him overall at Carolina, and it's time for him to go somewhere else. And it's time for Carolina to stop depending on him. And it's time for them to be better coached and play together more than they did when everybody was kind of waiting for Caleb to get hot. So I hope it is a big win-win for Caleb Love and UNC.
Yeah, that's good basketball analysis. And I know it's not one of the bigger wins, but against my alma mater, UCLA, Caleb Love did okay in the tournament last year as well.
You know, when you think about Carolina basketball, when you think about I've said it many times, lightning in a bottle. That's what they caught in March.
Yeah.
Where they caught it and they got it and they did it. But everybody was waiting for that to happen again, and for Brady Manick and a lot of other reasons. But without Caleb Love and the pass that the turnover that Baycott saved out of bounds and threw it back in bounds, right to Love at the top of the key and drained the three to basically win the game. Yeah. Without that shot, they don't go. How about the way he played against Baylor? You know, and all of the games that he played that Carolina wouldn't have won if he hadn't made certain plays. So I think his legacy should be that he was as responsible as anybody, even Baycott, for getting to the Final Four.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say, and I'm actually serious when I say this, how much fun is the transfer portal? How much fun is NIL? I know not everyone thinks that. Yeah. Boy, it must be changing coaching. I can't even imagine what it's like, you know, just to know. But I'm actually really happy that a player, when they're unhappy somewhere, can go someplace, doesn't have to wait a year. You know, he's going to get people in. This is the way that it should have been for a long time. And I'm really kind of surprised, or maybe I'm not surprised, but I go around, I give a lot of talks about basketball, and everyone wants to say, what about NIL? I actually like NIL. I think NIL, once again, is a long time coming. I think NIL is a civil rights issue, and finally the civil rights of the players are being respected. But, you know, for everyone who's excited about Armando Baycott staying, thank NIL.
Exactly.
That's exactly why it's happening. So all this is to say, it is a different world in college basketball all of a sudden.
And I'm with you, Matt, on that. I mean, when college athletics was a multi-million-dollar enterprise back in the 60s and 70s, you know, you can make a case that a college scholarship, room, board, tuition, spending money, laundry, whatever they had, was a fair trade. Yeah. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the kids are still getting room, books, board, tuition, and laundry money. So it is time to reward the kids who bring the fans to the stadiums and the arenas, and they play a game on TV that millions of people watch. And as the Supreme Court said, I think it was Justice Kavanaugh who said, it's the only business in the history of the world where the most important employees don't get paid. Yeah. So it's ridiculous that's not happening. So I don't know what's going to happen in the long run in college athletics, but the big mistake, or I don't even know if it was a mistake, for NIL and the transfer portal to happen at the same time, because the transfer portal was supposed to be, you know, you can't get paid to play. And it happened with NIL at the same time. I remember Mac Brown told me before last season, he said, I'm trying to get guys to come here, to transfer here. And they're asking me how much NIL money I'm going to get. And I'm trying to explain to them what kind of a program we have there. And they go, no. Tell them, give me a figure, because I'll tell you what the other three schools are offering me.
Right. Some of the stories that are out there, I don't know if they're true, but
yeah. So the problem is it happened at the same time, and there's nobody regulating it, and nobody policing it, and there are no rules. So schools are going to, every school who engages in NIL in a different way, they all think they're doing it legally because no one has ever told them otherwise, you know.
Speaking of the transfer portal, breaking news from Diane Robertson in the chat that Paxton Wojcik of Brown has committed to the Tar Heels.
Oh, Paxton Wojcik. Well, we'll see.
So it's happening even as we talk, people coming in and out.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's probably not coincidental that happened the day that Love announced that he was leaving, because that's when the position became available. And I like that. I think Hubert Davis is a man of great honesty, character. I mean, he's really a great representative of Carolina. The jury's out on what kind of a basketball coach he is, and that's only because he's following two Hall of Fame era coaches, one he played for and one he worked for. So that's a tough act to follow. But as far as having somebody who represents the university the right way, Hubert's the guy. Absolutely. And so there's no funny business. There's no shenanigans. He's telling, you know, he told, from what I understand, he told Puff Johnson and his family that we love you. We want you to come back. But your track record of injuries and availability is to the point right now where we have to recruit someone else at that position. So I cannot guarantee you anything next year. And Puff went back and home, talked it over with his parents, and decided to transfer. So I think that kind of open dialogue is good for everybody.
That's great. I know we could probably have a whole other conversation about name, image, and likeness in sports, and I certainly welcome that conversation. So thank you for your thoughts on that. Have another question here I'd love to ask y'all from Adam, who writes, can you comment on the rivalry between Scott and John Roche and how that may have reflected the broader racial narrative?
What a great question. John Roche was the point guard for Frank McGuire at South Carolina in the late 1960s. And you have to understand the dynamic. First, there was the dynamic with Frank McGuire, who coached the Tar Heels in 1957, and from whose shadow Dean Smith had to escape. And it took him a long time. And then when he finally started winning ACC championships, McGuire had gone back. He left Carolina to go coach Wilt Chamberlain with the Philadelphia Warriors. When the Warriors were sold to a group in San Francisco and was moving, Frank McGuire said, I'm not going, I'm an East Coast guy. And he got back into coaching. He took the South Carolina job, and it took him a few years to rebuild. And he rebuilt the Gamecocks kind of in the same way that he built the Tar Heels in the 50s, with tough-minded white kids from New York. And John Roche was one of those kids. And he was a terrific ball handler. And the one game that set up the rivalry between Roche and Charlie Scott was in an old North-South doubleheader in Charlotte in 1969, when McGuire played all 5 starters 40 minutes. Roche had 38 points. Scott had a pretty good game too, but Roche, no one knew him because he was a sophomore at that time. And his name and image and likeness and everything about him exploded in the public. And because there was racial prejudice in the ACC voting, John Roche, even though Carolina won the regular season and won the ACC tournament with the most spectacular game in the history of the tournament, he scored 28 points in the second half against Duke after Dick Grubar had injured his knee in the first 5 minutes of the game, and Bill Bunting fouled out midway through the second half. He scored 28 points in the second half, 40 overall, and led the Tar Heels to a comeback victory over Duke. And after that, John Roche was named ACC Player of the Year, or before that, whatever. But also on the ACC ballot, there were 5 players, voters who left Charlie Scott off, meaning that he wasn't among the top 5 players in the ACC, which is ridiculous. Now, you might be a South Carolina diehard who loved, everything about John Roche, and he was a great player. But to say that Charlie wasn't, in the top 5 in the league had to be racially tinged. And it was the only time that Dean Smith came out and used the word race about that in his career, because he wanted to stay out of public discourse on that. But those 2 guys set up the racial battle in the ACC, who was better. And the game that Carolina played at South Carolina after that game in Charlotte, and back then the North-South doubleheader was South Carolina and Clemson and Carolina and NC State. And the designated home team for that game in Charlotte did not get the home game on their court. So the Tar Heels had to go back to Columbia 12 days later. And Dean Smith would come out with the team, unlike some of these coaches. Hubert does it now, but some of these coaches make the big dramatic entrance at the last minute. Dean didn't do that. He went out and sat on the bench while the teams were warming up. And he said he had never heard anything like the barrage of racial cursing and epithets and everything that he said that was directed at Charlie. And after the game that the Tar Heels won on a bang charge blocking call with John Roche, and in the last minute of the game, the Tar Heels won, and Dean was walking off the court, and following the players into the tunnel, there was a young guy who leaned over the railing and called Charlie Scott a big black baboon and get the hell out of Columbia. And Dean stopped, turned around, ran up the stairs of the stands, and was going to take this guy on until the security stopped him. And Bill Guthridge, who saw it happen, ran up behind Dean to try and protect Dean. Those are the kind of things that happen. The really interesting thing was, years later, that same guy who caused that episode wrote a letter to Dean Smith. He had been born again or whatever, wanted to apologize, said he was completely, out of bounds in doing that. And there's a way that Dean Smith even affected someone else's life down the road. But the fact that all of that happened and Charlie Scott still turned out to be the player that he did. And the most important thing, when I've done book signings on Game Changers, everywhere, Vicky Lotz, who was John Lotz's widow, has been to the local ones, and she didn't marry John until 1971, I think. I don't even think she might have not known John in 1969, but I always say we're glad to have Vicky Lotz in our audience today because her late husband, John Lotz, saved Carolina basketball. And everybody would look at me like, what are you talking about? And I tell the story about in 1969, after all of this racial voting had happened, the Tar Heels are in the Eastern Regional. They're playing Duquesne on Thursday night, a very close game, and the Tar Heels win it. Now, this is not like to really disparage the press in North Carolina, but I'm doing that by saying this was the Washington media that got around Charlie, and they knew that he was unhappy about the voting. And Charlie told them that this is the first time in his life that basketball had ever come into the racial issue. It was all about race before that. This time it was basketball. And now the Black Student Movement that's on campus, that's been this group that Charlie has been trying to support, but keep at arm's length, they're calling him and they're telling him that he has to do something, right, to help these 23, by the way, Michael Jordan's number, these demands to Carlisle citizens were passed. And so the next two days later on Saturday, they're playing Davidson for the second year in a row in the Elite Eight to get to the Final Four. Dick Grubar isn't playing. He's injured in the tournament, out for the season. And my fraternity brothers, Jim Delaney and Eddie Fogler, started in the backcourt. Davidson has the third-ranked team in the country with Mike Malloy and all the guys that Charlie helped recruit for Lefty when he thought he was going to Davidson. Imagine that team that they had with Charlie Scott on it. But the morning of that game at Cole Fieldhouse, Randy Forehand, the manager, knocks on all the doors of the team and says, Coach Smith wants to meet in his room. And this is unusual for Coach Smith, who did everything planned by the book, the schedule. Everybody had a schedule. They knew when the pregame meals were, when the bus was leaving, and you better be there 3 minutes early, all that kind of stuff. Now they all pile into the room, and John Lotz and Charlie Scott are not there. And people are looking around and they want to know where Charlie and Coach Lotz are. And Coach Smith says, they're together and they're talking, but they say they're going to meet us at Cole Fieldhouse. Well, what happened that morning was that they were riding around College Park in Dean's rental car, and John Lotz was trying to talk Charlie out of not playing in that game. And he was saying to Charlie, look, the guys who left you off the ballot, we know why they did it. There's nothing you can do about that. You play in this game, and who are you going to hurt? You're going to hurt your fans, the people who love you, and especially your teammates. And he convinced Charlie to play in the game. And Charlie scored 32 against Davidson, hit the buzzer beater to send the Tar Heels to the third straight Final Four. My contention is that if Charlie Scott hadn't played in that game, he would have gone back to campus with the rest of the team. And on Monday morning, Dean Smith would be in South Building in front of whoever, chancellor, president, board of trustees, board of governors, whatever it was. And they would be asking him, Coach, tell us why the kid that we gave a scholarship to play basketball at UNC decided not to play in the most important game of the year. And Dean would have said, well, I give my players the power to do that, to make their own decisions. In this case, there was race involved. And they would have said again, now, Coach, let me ask you a question. Why did you not make the guy that we gave a scholarship to play basketball here play in the most important game of the year? That meeting would not have ended well. And my contention is that Charlie's legacy, maybe somebody would have forgiven him years later, but his legacy would have been different for a long time. And my other contention is the next year when Charlie Scott, 2 years later, when Charlie Scott was gone, Dean Smith loses his job because he had not yet fully escaped the shadow of Frank McGuire. It wasn't until the early 70s when Tar Heels won the NIT with a team that was picked to finish sixth in the ACC that Dean Smith was finally accepted as a great coach as well as a good recruiter. So I always tell Vicky Lotz, John saved Carolina basketball. So you can imagine what would happen if Dean Smith had been fired in the early 70s and Charlie Scott's legacy would have been tarnished like that. Got it? Anybody
I've
still?
got nothing to add there. I mean, we've got the UNC basketball encyclopedia right here. You can possibly add anything.
Okay.
That was impressive for sure.
That's great. Well, Brian, I think we'll turn it back over to you to close us out, as well as Melissa and Art and Matt. Thank you again so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, this has been fantastic. I have really enjoyed getting to know both of you. Do you have any other closing remarks that you'd like to say before we wrap up here, Art, Matt?
No, I thanks Melissa and her crew for this. I mean, it's a tremendous honor to have Game Changers, one of the 5 books in the North Carolina Reads program. And I think the story of Game Changers is a story that everybody who loves basketball at Carolina, everybody who loves basketball in the South, and everybody who understands the struggles that blacks and whites still have all over this planet, but had back then as well, should read the book to understand where this great basketball program came from. And it's a story that it should be mandatory reading to them, not because I wrote it, because the story is true, and it's one that everybody should know and understand. So thank you for your willingness to promote the book and get more people to read it as well. And Matt, thank you. I can't thank you enough, Matt. You've been the greatest proponent of the book that we have.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you to NC Humanities for assigning this book statewide, and Art again for writing a bit. And I'm going to say one more time, we keep saying it's a basketball book. It's not a basketball book. It's a book about race in North Carolina, and it's one of the best ones that I've ever read.
Well, thanks. It was fun to write, and I learned so much about it myself, and that really makes writing fun when you learn so much in the course on the process of it.
And let me just say one more thing, because I've told everybody that I've met since I've read the book how wonderful it is. And I mean this, every single sentence, there are 3 or 4 facts. It is one of the most well-researched books that I've ever read, including academic books. And you will 100%, regardless of how well the history of the South, Chapel Hill, North Carolina basketball, you will absolutely learn so much from this book. So I really encourage everybody, if you haven't read it or if you've just started it, it's unbelievable. And thank you, Art, for writing it, and thank you, Matt, for teaching it. And it's just fantastic.
And thank you, Brian, for narrating
it. Glad to do a small part here.
Okay.
So.
Well, a special thank you to Art and Matt for their conversation that was deeply enlightening and just a wealth of knowledge and information. And thank you to Brian for moderating this evening's program. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our wonderful audience for attending and for asking questions. We really appreciate your time and engagement, and so glad to hear all of the connections in the chat and how much you all enjoyed the book. At the conclusion of this event, those of you who registered with an email address will receive a brief survey to complete, so we would greatly appreciate you doing that to hear your feedback on this program, and we'll also be reaching out to let everyone know when the recording is available. You can visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about other upcoming events in the North Carolina Read series, and to subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date with all NC Humanities news and programs. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a great evening.